to a whole new area of technology. And this and what we're seeing now with this global warming issue is kind of the catalyst for that. What do you think about that idea?
Well, I think that is, there is something to be said about having a limiting supply and the ability then to force the people, the innovators and so forth, to create alternatives to whatever it is that is the problem. And I'm seeing that happen. In fact, as I travel around the country giving talks and so forth, very often an engineer or somebody of that caliber working for a company or by itself, for instance, will come up and say that they've developed a process that will do this, that will reduce the energy efficient in the internal combustion engine by 20% or 30% or something of that nature. Mm. And the automobile industries or the oil industries buy those up and then sit on them and do not allow them to be introduced into our economy, and as a consequence, they're keeping the status quo. I think that there is something to be said about alternative sources or the actual improvement of our efficiency and so forth of the production capability, internal combustion engine, you name it. I think that is out there. It's just that the politics of what is happening is preventing that from actually reaching the market.
Well, unfortunately, I think you're right there too, because I mean we have people like, well, take the guy who allegedly has developed a car that run on water. Stanley Myers, I think his name was. Mm-hmm. And I think that he was, quote unquote, taken out, so to speak. So I mean that's very unfortunate that they either buy up the inventions or just plain and simply actually murder people to get rid of them.
Yeah, I've seen that happen in several different cases where. Back in the 1960s, now I'm going out on a limb here. Mm-hmm. I'm not a physicist and I don't understand these things, so understand where I'm coming from. But I had a chance to talk to an engineer who was the lead development man for one of the runabouts of our boat industry back in the 1960s and 70s. And about 7 years ago, he attended one of my meetings and took me aside afterwards and told me his boat company had actually developed anti-gravity technology. Mm-hmm. This was astonishing, and so forth. He said they actually got a working model that would levitate themselves, 5 to 10 feet off the floor and so forth, and the government came right in and shut them down. The company went bankrupt.
Yeah, there we go. And I mean, the potential here is that when a lot of people are into this. The new technologies or innovating themselves at a certain point, I guess that they can't stop it. I mean, we have people now, for instance, one called John Cancius. He was actually lighting salt water on fire with the help of a radio frequency generator. Right. We have a company in France that are developing cars that run on compressed air. People can just go to theaircar.com to check that out. Then we have people like John Hutchinson, John Bedini, Tom Bearden, energy from the vacuum, So I'm hopeful, that when we come out of all of this, debacle that we're seeing now, that we could potentially have some new, very clean and more efficient, energy on our hands, so to speak.
Absolutely, and that's what concerns me too about having this public-private partnership. With government and corporations and so forth, is that they have a tendency to control all that and shut it down and not allow that to enter the marketplace where it should, because it would help all mankind and so forth, but it would not help them, so they prevent it from happening.
And then we're back to the idea again of let's talk about Gore again, for instance. I mean, if he were so sincere in his in his agenda here, so to speak, I'm hearing very little about new technologies. We're hearing about ethanol and things like this, but that's turned out not be such a good idea, especially in regards to how it will affect the food production and things like this. But again, why aren't we hearing about all this new fantastic technology that is coming online? When they're so concerned.
That's a very, very good question, and you bring up Gore. And Gore, is always making these proclamations of having caps and taxing carbon and that sort of thing. When it's to his advantage to do so, because he has ownership, or at least part ownership, in different companies for sequestering carbon and carbon dioxide and so forth into old salt mines and that type of thing. When he himself flies around, and of course jet planes and that type of thing, as well as his own house, uses something like 80 times more energy than the average citizen in the United States. And he basically says, he excuses himself for that and saying, well, I actually purchased these energy credits with these different companies and so forth. Well, that may be nice, but the average person can't afford to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And we're almost being, how should I put it, cornered in a way. The recent news story that came out regarding low energy light bulbs, it was said that if you break them, the mercury is actually released into the air, which is, highly toxic, and it seems to be, a much worse idea, so to speak, than to go with the old ones, old light bulbs.
Which is really, really alarming when you think about it, because in order to protect the environment, we're going to do something that is very harmful to the environment and to human health. And that, it just does not make any sense. There is time, you're going to be unavoidable that you're going to break some of those sometimes.
Yeah.
It's going to happen. I mean, that's just life. And you're not even supposed to occupy the room in which it broke for at least 2 to 3 days.
That's right.
Now, does that make much sense? No, it doesn't. It's not a good alternative, and yet that's being pushed. In fact, the Congress of the United States and President Bush just signed a bill that would prohibit all incandescent light bulbs, I think in 2 years or something of that nature.
Really?
And we'd have to be forced to go to these kinds of things that are going to be more expensive. They're going to have environmental hazards, health hazards, and to get rid of them when they finally do burn out, you have to have special accommodations, and you have to have it paid. You have to pay someone to dispose of them.
Sheesh, my God. Yep, there we go. It's it's too many inconsistency when you actually begin to look at it. And I mean, okay, again, it's an effort to go in one direction. I mean, why not have, what do you call it, cold light? I think light that does not emit any form of heat. Again, there's new technology, but I mean, it's too much with these new light bulbs here. But one thing I want to return to and talk a little bit more about was something that you mentioned in the first segment, and this was regarding the connection between food production and CO2. And one idea when you mentioned that kind of popped up in my head was that could that actually then be a part of this plan, so to speak, to actually reduce the production of food for not only third world countries but also the Western world? I mean, a consequence if we cut down on all this CO2 is that we potentially get less and less food on the planet, and that is very alarming, right?
Very alarming. One of the things that you probably should have in the back of your mind at all times, that he who controls water, he controls food, he who controls property, which produce water and food, any of those things, anyone who controls those things controls your life, because you have to have those things to live from day to day. And food is one of them, and there's been some discussion in the United States about having government control over our food production. And one of the ways that they could possibly do that is by having food shortage. We've already had land bank programs in the United States we've taken about half of the farmland that's available in the United States and put it into non-productive conservation purposes, that the farmers and so forth are paid not to produce crops. And this is a system, if they begin to do this and control our food, they literally will control every person in this country, because anybody that objects is going to be in big trouble.
That's right. Do you think that this could in some way be connected with the idea? A lot of people are talking about the depopulation idea, that the elites of this planet want to have less people around. Do you think that this could connect with that?
Well, one of the things that I was able to do in 1994, it's a long time ago, but I'll just give you the background of it. The Convention on Biological Diversity was coming up in the United States Senate for ratification. And I was aware of what was going on. I've been tracking it for a number of years. Knew that it was created, the Convention on Biological Diversity was actually written by the same organization that was proposing a huge population reductions. And in the document that I showed the U.S. Senate to kill it, I killed it an hour before it was scheduled to be ratified, myself and 3 other people.
Okay.
Before we were able to demonstrate, according to the United Nations documents themselves, that they plan to reduce the human population to 2 billion people from the present, at that time, I think it was about 5 to 5.5 billion. It's over 6 billion now. And that alarmed the U.S. Senate so much, and the fact that they wanted to take out, in order to protect biological diversity, they were talking about putting in a huge reserve and corridor system, which is basically wilderness over half of the United States, and of course Europe and the rest of the world as well, in order to protect nature. This is the structure of which this treaty was based upon. And when I finally was able to point that out to the U.S. Senate and had the actual United Nations documents to back myself up, they abandoned the effort, and it was never voted on back in 1994. The point of that is that population control is a major, major thrust of a lot of these international treaties. Food production is one of them. They said in that document that even though they know that the Green Revolution back in the 60s and 70s now produced most of the food for the world, because of fertilizers, genetics, and so forth, would have to be abandoned in this approach. By that treaty, it would have to be abandoned. But that's just the way it was going to be, because the fertilizers are so polluting, and genetics are changing the genetic structure of the ecosystems, or the crops and so forth, and they would have to do that. And even though they recognized that by doing so they would cause massive starvation. They said that in this document. That's why it was so effective in the U.S. Senate to actually get this treaty from being ratified, stop it from being ratified. And it's amazing how, if you look at all of these different things, they have this idea that we shouldn't have more than 1 to 2 billion people on planet Earth. We have 6.5 billion now, and therefore they must be eliminated also somehow over the next 100 years. And it's so alarming that I really had to dig into it. And what I found was, and we published a document on this, that there really isn't an overpopulation problem in the world right now. In fact, the United Nations even acknowledges it in their database. You can go on the United Nations and their population department and so forth, run the projections yourself, and there isn't a problem. What they have done is they said that the population, given what we have today, it reduces, it comes down every single year, but what exists today would peak at about 2009 to 2010 in global population, and it would start to decline. Really? And yeah, it is amazing. Population is not a major issue anymore. As nations become more wealthy, and this is one of the things I think that we as a people need to focus on, is to help these nations to become more wealthy. What happens is that the families, in an impoverished nation, in order to have something to protect yourself when you grow old, you had to have a lot of kids to support you. That's right. Well, that disappears in a first world nation like you have in Europe and the United States. Now it becomes expensive to have kids because you're putting them through college and so forth. And there is a natural tendency to have smaller families when you have a richer nation. And this is what's happening in a lot of these third world nations, is they are getting more wealthy, and as a consequence, their population growth is diminishing to the point where it was, I'm guessing at it right now because I don't remember the exact numbers, but something like 2.6 or even 3.1 children per family 15 or 20 years ago. It's dropped now to 2.15, and the stabilization process of the world is at about 2.05 or 2.5, and we're almost there. We're almost at the point where we have zero population growth because of the natural dynamics of what's happening in the world today. Sure, and that's a very important point, I think, and that should be one of the global agendas, to kind of see over the distribution of wealth in that regard, and actually make sure, as you say, that, the extent of the poverty around planet, that's a catastrophe if nothing else. It is a major, and it's real. It's here right now. We don't have to try to foresee what's going to happen in 50 years. It exists right now. Yeah. And tragically, the whole concept of the United Nations Sustainable Development Program that they have to supposedly solve the environmental problems as well as protect or increase the wealth of nations that are currently impoverished, those policies will do exactly the opposite. We know now. We know there's been some major studies done on a global basis where wealth is created based on private property rights. You have to have the ability to guarantee your property so the bank can treat your property as an asset and as a form of collateral that you can start a business with.